We have to, because in the book of Hebrews, when we get to the faith of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, they're just one verse, but frankly, it does not make sense at all what is being commended by the writer of Hebrews unless you understand their life story. Now, we tend to know what Abraham's life was like, and so it's a little bit easier. In fact, when we look at the by faith statements in Hebrews chapter 11, we kind of naturally see why it is so great that they did what they did. Enoch walked with God. Noah built an ark. Abraham, who was the first of the patriarchs to be called by God to go to this land and is blessed. We see what is so marvelous about their faith. Sacrificing your own son. That's tremendous. It's very easy to tell that that is a huge act of faith. And we've been seeing how that connects always to the promise of God, that faith is not about hoping things are going to turn out in the end, or even some kind of internal feeling that this is going to go well, or that God's going to do what he said he's going to do. It's a conviction that when God says something, he's absolutely going to do it. And yet when we get to Isaac and Jacob and now Joseph, it starts to get hard. I'm telling you, just in all honesty, when I got to Hebrews chapter 11 and I saw that I was going to be preaching those verses, I just didn't know what to expect or why God made a big deal through the writer of Hebrews about the faith of Isaac just because he invoked future blessings on Jacob and Esau. So originally when I was mapping this out to preach it, I was just going to do one sermon on Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And again, as you know, last week, just on Isaac, we spent quite a while on him. And it's important. It's important because there's a lot of assumptions being made by the writer of Hebrews that you already know these stories. And some of you do, but I can't assume that. And so for the sake of my own conscience, to not withhold any of the word of God from you, I want to preach to you what happened in the life of these famous patriarchs in the Old Testament, so that you know why the writer of Hebrews is saying, by faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff, which we talked about last Sunday. This week, even more awkward. Look at verse 22. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. And that is his tremendous act of faith. Now, it's unexpected because, again, if you've been in Sunday school for 3 weeks, you're going to have a lesson on Joseph and something that he did, because his life is full of these faithful choices that he made in his life. And we're going to look at some of them today in an overview fashion, not in depth, but any one of these scenes, him at Potiphar's, him at the Pharaoh's, him with his brothers, any one of those could have been a really good example of what faith is like, what trust in the Lord is like. But this almost makes you scratch your head, right? His trophy in the Hall of Faith, if you think of it like the Hall of Fame of Faith, Joseph's trophy says, Joseph, he made mention of the Exodus and what to do with his bones. And you think, why is that an achievement? Why does that deserve the Medal of Honor in God's hallowed halls of faith? But hopefully we'll see by the end of tonight that it fits perfectly into the narrative that we've seen in Hebrews, and that we've seen in the faith of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So once again, we've got to go back to Genesis 37. We need to know what happened in Joseph's life to know why it's significant that at the end of it, what he gets a commendation for is that he talked about the Exodus, which hadn't happened yet. It's going to be 400 years plus, and this is what I want you to do with my bones, okay? So, Genesis 37. Now, there's a reference I meant to write down. It just popped in my head, And now it's going to bug me because I didn't write it down and I won't be able to find it. So pray while we're doing this that I remember. It's in Exodus. All right. Again, this pulling back the veil of preaching preparation. Sometimes you have these thoughts as you're about to preach. Okay. Genesis 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. This is how Joseph's story starts. It starts with his dad. Now remember, his dad had a lot of kids, 12 sons, and what number is Joseph? He is number 11. So we do want to keep that sort of thing in mind. This verse is very important because God had promised Abraham that him and his descendants would live in this certain land. Now when they finally arrived there, they're still, even now that it's been Abraham to Isaac, Isaac to Jacob, even at this point, they're still wandering in the land of the Canaanites, in the promised land. Another way to think of this is that the Jewish patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they were promised the world in a way, but they were living like homeless people in the land that God had promised them. So it might make you question, God, are you going to keep your promises or not? But part of the evidence of their faith that we see in Hebrews is that they keep trusting that someday, one day, their descendants would dwell in that land. And so for the story here to refresh in chapter 37 with the reminder that Jacob lived in the land of Isaac's sojournings, it's a reminder that the promise has not been fulfilled yet that God had promised to Abraham. We're introduced then to Joseph in the following verses. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. Now, they were his wives, but if you remember, there were Rachel and Leah's servants with whom he had children. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now, Israel, that's another name for Jacob, loved Joseph more than any other of his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him, could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him. But his father kept the saying in mind. Again, we're introduced to Joseph, the firstborn of Rachel. Rachel was Jacob's favorite wife. Remember, he wanted to marry Rachel, but Laban pulls a switcheroo on him. He gets Leah, Rachel's sister, instead. So he works for both of them, but he favored Rachel. Rachel did not have a son or children until late, after Jacob ended up having 10 other kids between Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah, the maidservants. But finally he bore Joseph, the 11th out of all the sons, and there was one more son, if you remember, Benjamin, born by Rachel, and Rachel died, giving birth to Benjamin. So 12 sons in total. 2 of them from Rachel, the favored wife, Joseph being the older, Benjamin being the younger, and Joseph's brother, or Joseph, is the one that is favored by Jacob. He was playing favorites, just as we have seen in the past. This never ends well. Now you got to think of it this way. All of Joseph's brothers are older than him except for Benjamin, and they're all from other women. And I'm sure that The children from Bilhah and Zilpah would have been extra hostile because they were like lesser. They were the maidservants, right, of Rachel and Leah, whom Jacob worked for. It doesn't help that Jacob is giving Joseph extra gifts like the infamous robe of many colors. And so we can see this hostility and this hatred very naturally being set up, this antagonism. Now, there's a few things that we want to pick up that are going to become themes throughout Joseph's life. I picked out 3. You can pick out more. But the first one is this: Joseph's integrity about doing a job right. He's got a supervisor's eye. He knows how things should be done. So his father is sending him out to check on how the other brothers are shepherding the flock. And he gives his father, a bad report. Says they are terrible at shepherding. They don't watch the sheep. They aren't feeding them. And so he has this administrative eye, this supervisor's eye, and he's trustworthy. He is a man of integrity. It's the first thing we see. Second thing that this narrative tells us is that God is with Joseph. This is a phrase that comes up all the time. From here to the end of Genesis, God is with them. The Lord is with them. People see that the Lord is with Joseph. And so we see here that Joseph has dreams from God. That's how you know that God is with Joseph. One of the ways that you see is that he has these dreams. Now, by the way, we've had dreams come up a few times before in the book of Genesis. We had dreams come up with Laban and Abimelech, and that was God giving them warnings. These are pagan leaders, and God's giving them a warning about doing something bad against his people. His father Jacob, if you remember, he saw that stairway between earth and heaven with the angels going up and down on it. That was in a dream as well. But Joseph was a dreamer in a different way. He saw things that were going to happen. He had prophetic dreams speaking of the future. So in a way, the Bible actually doesn't ever call Joseph a prophet, but he was. God was with him, and you knew it because God is telling him through these dreams what is going to happen. Interestingly, while God speaks directly to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, Joseph never receives a direct communication from God. He never hears from God directly. It's always through these dreams that these things are being communicated. At the same time, Joseph seems to have no doubt at all that God is with him, that God was purposing everything that was happening to him, and that he is always under the watchful care of his God. It's significant that what the writer of Hebrews commends Joseph for is essentially a prophecy, sort of, about the Exodus that's going to come hundreds of years later. So the second thing that God is with Jacob. First is that Joseph has this integrity about doing a job right, about doing his work as unto the Lord. The third thing that this tells us about Joseph is that God intends Joseph to be a blessing. He is a blessing, and he is going to be blessed. So it's not just that God is with him, but along with that, Joseph is going to bless everybody that he is around, and God intends to bless Joseph, even to the point where these dreams he has are about his brothers bowing down before him, even his father and his mother bowing down before him, giving him honor. So, spoiler alert, this will happen. He will be honored by his family. He will save them from being wiped out, and they will literally bow down before him. Ultimately, God is going to use Joseph to keep his promise about the Abrahamic covenant. We're going to see that's how this all ties together. Without Joseph, Jacob and his sons and their family, they would have died in the famine. And for this, if you remember, it's significant that Jacob blessed Joseph's children as if they were his own children, and that's a tremendous sign of Jacob acknowledging that without Joseph, he would have perished and the covenant would have been broken. So, we come now to the rest of Genesis, and so we're going to see those three themes. We're not going to spend as much time on each narrative section as I just did there, but Joseph in his integrity, God is with him, and God is going to bless Joseph in all that he does. Those are some of the things that we see up here. So the next scene in Genesis 37 sets up how Joseph becomes a slave in Egypt, and the brothers are out shepherding again, and Jacob once again sends Joseph to check in on his brothers because he's good at this sort of thing. You can trust that Joseph's not going to be bought off by his brothers. He knows that he is a godly man full of integrity, and so he goes down to check in on his brothers, finds out that they're goofing off in a place called Dothan. And when they see Joseph coming, the brothers just start getting resentful and angry. Here's this dreamer. And they decide at that moment, out in the middle of nowhere, that they're going to kill him and throw him into a pit. Now, pits were common in those days for capturing lions and other predators, especially if you're a shepherd. You don't necessarily want to go toe-to-toe with a lion or something. So they had pits for that sort of thing, and let's kill him, let's throw him into a pit. We can say easily that he fell in, was killed by some kind of beast. Now Reuben, firstborn of Jacob through Leah, so the firstborn of Jacob, and it was with Leah, the unfavored wife, he tries to intervene, and he has his own scheme to rescue Joseph. He said, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, verse 22, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him." And his thought was, we throw him into this pit, I'll come back later, and I will rescue him. So that this way he doesn't, they've got a bloodlust, so he's letting them get it out, but he's going to come and rescue his brother later. Now, problem is, as Joseph is in this pit, a caravan comes by, and it gives Judah an idea. Judah is the fourth son of Leah. And Judah sees this caravan, and he has an idea. Hold on. We could get rid of him and make money off of him. It's just, it's like a classic joke about an older brother trying to sell his younger brother on eBay or something just to get rid of him and make him pocket a little bit of money on the side, okay? And so Judah hatches this plan, and so the next caravan that's coming of Midianites, get Joseph out of the pit, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and he is on his way to Egypt. Judah here is, he has his own character arc in this section. It would probably make a good sermon series on its own. I'll intersperse maybe some of his life. But at this point, Reuben's plan is foiled. He can't rescue his brother. They now are in a scramble for what to do, and so they hatch a deception. They are going to tell their dad, they're going to take his cloak, get a goat, slaughter it, and put the blood all over it, and say an animal killed poor Joseph when he was out looking for us. And so again, Jacob, remember, he's the deceiver, isn't he? So often he gets deceived. It comes back to haunt him over and over again. So again, he is deceived here. He thinks his precious son Joseph is dead. And so it goes that Joseph ends up in the house of Potiphar. Now, Genesis 38 is a pretty awful story about Judah's immorality, that fourth son. And I think it's actually what God uses to humble Judah to fear the Lord. So we won't get into the details of that, but it's a pretty sordid story. But I think it produces the humility that we'll see later on in Judah's life and in Joseph's life, and perhaps is the reason that Jacob offers the blessing to Judah that from his line will come the kingly rule. And of course, David comes from the line of Judah, and Jesus comes from the line of Judah. Anyways, chapter 39 is that very familiar story of Joseph at Potiphar's house. Potiphar was an officer of Pharaoh, a captain of the guard. and an Egyptian. He bought him from those Ishmaelites, and Joseph did what he does, which is he sees administrative tasks, he's a slave, and he does them well. He sees supervisor tasks, and he knows how to get things done, and you can trust him. And as it so happens, he rises in the ranks of Potiphar's house. Even Potiphar realizes that the Lord was with him, and that whatever Joseph did, he blessed. And Joseph was blessed. And so he rises up in the household to be essentially in charge of everything there, second only to Potiphar in Potiphar's house. But like the story with his brothers, there's another monkey wrench that's thrown in the story of Joseph's ministry success: Potiphar's wife. So one thing that Joseph had no authority or control over, and rightly so, because Potiphar's wife is Potiphar's. They are united in marriage that's off limits to Joseph. And Joseph fears the Lord, and so when she offers herself to Joseph, he says in verse 9, "He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" So his integrity isn't just about, I work hard in the workplace, I do my job well. It's an integrity before the Lord in his morality, in his character. And so he refuses to give in to this temptation. And so for this, Potiphar's wife executes a deception. Again, it's all over Jacob's story and even his kids, a deception. He grabs his cloak, his robe, and as Joseph tries to flee, and then claims that Joseph tried to take her by force to Potiphar, and Potiphar, believing his wife, has Joseph thrown into another pit. This time, a prison. Verse 20, "And Joseph's master, Potiphar, took him, put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and showed him steadfast love, and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge, because Yahweh was with him. And whatever he did, Yahweh made it succeed." What do we see? Again, Joseph's integrity, Joseph's industriousness. God is with Joseph. God blesses Joseph. God blesses everything that Joseph touches, and others are blessed by Joseph. I think it's a sign of his trustworthiness, his hard work, of course, and the faithfulness of God, that the captain of the guard appoints Joseph to babysit, as we see in chapter 40, this cupbearer of the king and a baker. Now, Potiphar was a captain of the guard as well. And then you see here in verse 3 that he put them, the Pharaoh put them, this cupbearer and this baker, in the custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he tended them. They continued for some time in custody. So I get the feeling this is not probably Potiphar, but this was probably one of Potiphar's friends. I'm sure all the captains of the guard knew each other, and I'm sure that some of the reason that he did so well there is that his reputation, Joseph's reputation, preceded him. And so he's in this very cushy position. It's very odd when you put a prisoner in charge of the other prisoners, isn't it? But he had just that kind of authority. If anything needed to be done, they gave it to Joseph to do. So it's almost like he worked there. But that's not as luxurious as it might seem, I suppose, to work in prison. But at least he wasn't on the lowest rung of that prison. In Genesis 40, dreams come back into play again, because if you recall, the cupbearer and the baker both have dreams. And Joseph's ability to discern the prophetic meaning of dreams comes into play. Now, as far as the story's concerned, like, it doesn't care about the cupbearer or the baker at all, right? You don't even get their names. You don't even get what they did to get thrown into this prison. It's all incidental to the plot, which is that God is trying to keep his covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Joseph needs to end up in Pharaoh's house. So, he gives an interpretation of these dreams. It's favorable to the cupbearer. It's not favorable to the banker. And the cupbearer ends up being restored to the Pharaoh's house. Now Joseph tells him, when you get there, remember me. Remember me to the Pharaoh. But the cupbearer did not remember Jesus, but forgot him. Genesis 40, verse 23. It's a little bit sad because as you're reading the story, just as you start to have hope for Joseph, this guy forgets. How long is he in this prison for after that? Genesis 41:1, after 2 whole years. So he spent another 2 years in this prison. We don't have any idea what happens in those 2 years, but I can pretty much guarantee that Joseph was the best prisoner and prisoner keeper that Egypt has ever seen. I don't know if I would die on that hill, but I'm pretty positive that in the history of Egypt's prisoners, he was an excellent prisoner, an excellent prison keeper, but of course he was still in prison, not able to affect much in his world. In Genesis 41, once again, dreams come up. This time, Pharaoh's dreams. He has these peculiar dreams about skinny cows eating fat cows and all sorts of things, ears of grain eating thin ears of grain, swallowing fat ears of grain. Very peculiar. But this reminds the cupbearer, hold on, I remember someone who was able to interpret my dreams. He actually feels bad because when he brings it up to Pharaoh in verse 9, he says, I remember my offenses today. He remembers Joseph and thought, I was going to tell Pharaoh right away. It's been 2 years now. And so the cupbearer does, thankfully, remember his promise to Joseph, and Joseph is brought up from prison to explain to Pharaoh the dreams. The dreams are essentially that there is a famine that's going to come. There's going to be 7 years of prosperity, and then there's going to be 7 years of a severe famine, and Joseph gives Pharaoh the warning, God is telling you this is what is going to happen. And here's a plan, Pharaoh. He says in verse 33 of chapter 41, Now therefore, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That food shall be reserved for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. So essentially, he gives a suggestion on how to manage this famine. And look at Pharaoh's response, verse 37. This proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, Can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, Since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, See, I've set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, Bow the knee! Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph is second in command, second in authority, second in honor to Pharaoh himself. He's given an Egyptian name and an Egyptian wife. Now, this is a roller coaster of experiences for Joseph, from one pit to another pit. His robe has gotten him in trouble twice now. He goes from favor to despair to a rise of fortunes, back to destitution, up and down. But through it all, Joseph was faithful. Through it all, he maintained his integrity, his industriousness, trusted that the Lord was keeping him, blessing him. There's not one verse that describes a resentful attitude or a bitter heart or a frustrated word or anything but consistent faithfulness from Joseph. Quite unlike his forefathers, even Isaac, who had a relatively quiet life. In the text, there's not one criticism made or implied about Joseph. He's the example of someone who kept faith and trust in God no matter the circumstances, isn't he? We want to be like Joseph. We don't want to maintain our integrity in hope of God's blessing, no matter if we're in a pit or if we're in a palace, right? Joseph is the guy that we want to be. And we see him blessing, the Lord blessing him. But again, none of these stories are what the writer of Hebrews commends Joseph for. Remember, his plaque reads, he made mention of the Exodus and told people where to put his bones. That's his claim to fame. Think about that. I could have given you a half dozen sermons, maybe more, just about Joseph's life up until this point. But we haven't hit gold yet, as far as the writer of Hebrews is concerned. We haven't hit the thing that defines him acting in faith before the Lord yet. Why? Why? Because what Joseph has done so far have been good things, but they haven't reflected a trust in the promise of God. His place, his specific place in the promise of God as a descendant of the Abrahamic covenant. Joseph hasn't exercised faith in the same covenant that God has been using to define the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He had an individual conviction, it sounds like, of God's purpose and plan, of his obedience before the Lord, his integrity. But I think we can pick up the threads of what his attitudes was towards the covenant of his father Jacob. I think we can see a few threads if we start adding things up, all right? Let's add a few things up. How long has Joseph been away from home? Verse 46 says Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. How old was he at the beginning of Genesis 37? He was 17. So roughly speaking, 13 years he's been in the land of Egypt. Basically spent his entire life there, his adult life in Egypt, away from the land of promise, where he grew up, where God had promised that they ought to live. He has an Egyptian name now, Zephanath Paneah. He has an Egyptian wife. He's got a pretty nice Egyptian job, really nice Egyptian job. And see how he names his children. Go to verse 50 in Genesis 41. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Manasseh, it sounds like the Hebrew for to forget, making to forget. And Joseph's own explanation of the name is, what have I forgotten? God has made me forget all of the hardship of my father's house, being the 11th brother, living in the land that my fathers dwelt in. Ephraim sounds like the Hebrew for making fruitful. And Joseph explains the name, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Where did I really blossom and grow? Was it back when I was getting bullied with my brothers in the promised land? Or here, where I was a slave for a while, but now, look, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The names of his children, I think, reflect his attitudes about his family, about his homeland, about, I think, even the covenant. At least at this part, it seems in Joseph's life, he either doesn't see himself as a part of the covenant, or, that's nice for my brothers. Maybe they'll inherit the promise and dwell in the land. But I don't think that Joseph saw himself anymore as part of that covenant. I think we can make an argument that he figures this is the place that God wants me to dwell. It's Egypt. After all, he's the 11th in line. Yes, he was Jacob's favorite, but he's already seen them try to kill him. Was he going to even live long enough to gather the inheritance? As minuscule as it might be as the 11th son, was he even going to live that long? So I think in his mind, he's pretty much, this is not a bad deal in Egypt. Maybe this covenant, sure, it's great and fine for them. But for me, for all the exemplary acts of faith that Joseph has done up until this point, I think there's still one area that Joseph doesn't have it quite right yet. Or maybe better to say one area that his faith needed to be tested in. And it's not a small thing either. He needed to exercise a faith that superseded all the things that he'd done by faith already. He's done a lot of things by faith. He's dealt with a lot of stuff. Murderous brothers, false accusations, being thrown in prison. He's dealt with a lot of things, and yet what he needed to embrace by faith was a much bigger step of faith than all of those things. He needed to embrace the covenant as his own, the Abrahamic covenant as his own, which meant embracing his homeland, embracing his brothers. And so that's exactly where the narrative turns. As the famine begins, Joseph's brothers, affected by this famine, realize we have to go to Egypt. They are doing really well in this famine. We need to go down there and we need to try and buy some food. Genesis 42 and on is the beautiful story of Joseph's reconciliation to his brothers. Again, I'd encourage you just to read through it yourselves or listen to it on audiobook. It's a long story. It's beautiful, really. And you see that his brothers have changed, especially Judah. I think this was all a test, not just of the brothers, but of Joseph as well. When you think about what's happening here, Joseph could have destroyed his family, couldn't he? He could have done it passively by just saying, no, we're not going to give you any food, and then his whole line would have died out except for him. He could have also done it actively. He has the power. He's second only to Pharaoh, and there's many times where his brothers were basically at his whim. He could have had them executed, sentenced to death by framing them for a crime. We know that because that's what he does as part of testing his brothers. He frames them for a crime. He could have had them all put to death. In other words, Joseph was in a position where he could have threatened the Abrahamic covenant that was given to Isaac and to Jacob and to his sons. But he doesn't. It was a test, of course, of his brothers. Were they still the kind of men to backstab one of their own in order to keep themselves alive? Did they see themselves as part of God's covenant promise of blessing? And so Genesis 44, very famous, Benjamin, his younger brother, now Jacob's most precious because Joseph died, Benjamin, the little baby of the family, he becomes this unknowing, unwitting scapegoat accused of stealing from Joseph, and Joseph wants to see, are they going to throw him under the bus too? Genesis 44:14, when Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell before him on the ground. Joseph said to them, "What deed is this that you have done? Do you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination?" And Judah said, "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, We are my Lord's servants, both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found. Again, Benjamin was framed for stealing something. But he said, far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father. Just leave Benjamin here. Then Judah went up to him and said, oh, my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's ears, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servants, saying, have you a father or a brother? And we said to my Lord, we have a father, an old man, and a young brother, the child of his old age. His brother is dead, Joseph, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me that I may set my eyes on him. We said to my Lord, the boy cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. Then you said to your servants, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again. Again, Joseph setting up the test. No, you have to bring Benjamin. I'm going to make him a scapegoat, and I'll see how much you love your brothers. Skip down to verse 30. Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant our father with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. This is Judah telling Jacob, if I don't come back from Egypt with Benjamin, take my life instead. And so Judah says to Joseph, now therefore please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. They all return, they all bow. Judah is the spokesman, offering himself in place of Benjamin. And in this Joseph sees that he can reveal his identity. Verse 45, or chapter 45. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came near. And he said, I am your brother, Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it's not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son, Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near to me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that, his brothers talked with him. This is amazing. It's beautiful. It's one of the greatest... It is the culmination of Joseph's life of suffering. The payoff for his integrity and the faithful service in every situation that he found himself in. This was the payoff, that he recognized that God had done it in order to save his brothers. that God had, through Joseph's obedience and individual faith before the Lord, preserved the covenant by preserving his awful brothers, keeping them alive. The rest of Genesis is basically the conclusion of the narrative. All of Joseph's brothers' families and his father's family, they settled in Egypt in the very fertile lands of Goshen to wait out the famine. Jacob actually ends up dying there, and he blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. I think it's funny in Genesis 46, 34, that Joseph tells them, you need to tell Pharaoh that you guys are shepherds, because shepherds have a certain stigma associated with them, and he'll basically leave you alone. Just, you guys dwell there, you do your thing. So basically, Joseph is going to commend their shepherding ability to Pharaoh. I think that's funny because they're bad shepherds. They're not very good at it. That's the thing at the beginning of Genesis 37. So I think God has a little bit of a sense of humor how that all sort of circles back. But in Genesis 50 then, through verse 15 through 20, and here to the end, we are going to get why Hebrews chapter 11 commends Joseph in what seems like a very peculiar way. Starting verse 15. So this is after Jacob dies. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, it may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him. They're thinking he's only treating us nice because for our father's sake. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now, please, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. It's very similar, Genesis 50, verse 20 there, to 45:7 when he first reveals himself. No, this was God who did this, not you and not me. Maybe God never spoke to Joseph directly, but God was sovereign over all that happened to Joseph. And all Joseph did really was to be faithful to God and to trust him, yes. But we see that, again, what he's commended for is not for saving his brothers' lives, per se, is it? In Hebrews 11. That I think is explained further as we read the end of Genesis, starting verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. This is the act of faith that Hebrews is applauding and bringing to our attention. And it's the most awkward thing that he ever says or does. Out of all that we just read, out of all the heartwarming stories of redemption, reconciliation, of his integrity, of working hard, blessing people, keeping many people alive, the book of Hebrews says that by faith, Joseph made mention of the Exodus. And that's what he does here on his deathbed. Now, the word translated mention in Hebrews 11:22 is actually the word for remember or remembrance or to keep in mind. It's kind of awkward because it's almost like saying that Joseph was remembering the Exodus while he was lying there on his deathbed, and yet it hasn't happened yet. And so that's why they translate it, make mention of. But that's really the only place in the whole in the New Testament where this particular word gets used as make mention of, because everywhere else it means remember. But what Joseph is remembering is not the Exodus per se. It's the Exodus in the sense that they are currently in Egypt, and that is not where they're supposed to be. What he's remembering is the covenant that God made to Abraham. In Genesis 50:24, he mentions the land. This is the Exodus. Exodus, the word is not used here in Genesis 50, so if you're looking for it, it's not used. But it's implied by God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the Exodus that the book of Exodus will get its name from. So what really he is referencing and what the writer of Hebrews is saying is that at that moment, he was remembering what? The covenant that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do you know that Abraham's name is not even mentioned once, beginning in Genesis 37, until this? Abraham's name not mentioned once in the whole life of Joseph. Actually, I'm sorry, until Genesis 48:15. Genesis 48:15 is when Isaac talks about Abraham and the blessing. As he dies, the reminder to his children, the reminder of God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So prior to that, in all of Joseph's life, no mention of Abraham. Joseph doesn't utter at all in his whole life, in comparison to Isaac and Jacob and Abraham, of course, Joseph does not utter Abraham or Isaac's name in this whole narrative until this verse, Genesis 50, verse 24. And what Hebrews is pointing out is that in bringing up Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in bringing up the land of Egypt is not the promised land. You need to get out of there into the promised land. Joseph has finally put his faith in God's promise of the Abrahamic covenant. That's the act of faith that's being commended, that he finally sees in these last words. He's reminding his brothers, Egypt is not your home. This is not God's ultimate purpose and plan for you. You were made for, you were promised this land in which your forefathers dwell, and you have not seen the fulfillment of that promise. You must go back at some point. Egypt, which was Joseph's home for all of his adult life, but at the end of the life, he came to say, God has promised you a home you must return to, that even I must return to. So even though I pass away and my bones are here, you must carry them with you out of the land, into the land that God had promised to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's my home. So the act of faith is that while Joseph did amazing, marvelous, miraculous things in Egypt, things that we envy and we say, I wish I was like that. I wish I could have that kind of integrity. I wish I could deal with being in the pits of life in that way. Despite all the things that he did in Egypt, saving even the life of everyone in his family, let alone the families of Egypt, Joseph finally came to acknowledge and know and realize that God had allowed him all of these things so that he might keep his promise of the Abrahamic covenant. That this was really about not Joseph, that's what he says multiple times, this was about preserving life, your life, of my brothers. God is committed to keeping his word that he made hundreds of years before to Abraham, and that he had made pass on to Isaac, had passed on to Jacob, and that Jacob had passed on to Joseph. And Joseph finally saw and accepted and realized this is my purpose and place. It's within this covenant. God has kept me alive for this amazing achievement, that he would bless a people and a nation that would go on to establish a kingdom from which would come the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would be the king that we are waiting for, but also the sacrifice for sin, just as Judah offered himself as a substitute for Benjamin. Remember Hebrews 11:13-16? This is exactly the story. This is exactly why the writer of Hebrews is bringing up this act of faith in Joseph's life, is that his point has been, Hebrews 11:13, these all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. For all his achievements, Joseph was just passing through. He's looking ahead, or at least at the end of his life, he realized, for all that I did in Egypt, God's promises are for a place not here. God's promises are for another land. And ultimately, for every person, non-Jew as well, we are looking ahead to the city to come, the eternal promised land. We can have the same kind of faith that Joseph did. We can and should do amazing and wonderful things as we seek to be faithful to God, acts of integrity, using our gifts, whether administrative or musical or whatever they are, to bless others and to be blessed by God. But we should be doing all of it in a short little while in this life with the expectation that God is using us to save lives, and that this is not ultimately our final destination or home. Our individual lives of faith have a place in the overall purpose and plan of God. You're not just a lone ranger Christian out there trying to please God solo. Joseph wasn't, maybe he thought that after a certain while, I'm just out here on my own, I'm doing pretty well. At some point he came to realize, no, this is part of a bigger plan. Maybe not until his brothers were there did he realize this is part of a bigger plan. That God is using all of our individual acts of faith, all of our exercise of our integrity and hard work to bless other people, to show them the gospel, to spread his word, to build his church. We can have that same kind of faith. Wherever you are, in the pits or the palaces, you can have the same faith as Joseph did, because the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob is our God. And the promise of the Abrahamic covenant is a promise, when fully fulfilled, brings forth Christ, who is the Lord of all, who will sacrifice himself for sinners, and who will bring us into the family, the true fellowship, the true brotherhood of God. Heavenly Father, I thank you. And we do see in these words not just a story and not just history, but your very interactions in mankind for our redemption. None of us know where we will find ourselves tomorrow, whether betrayed or blessed, whether having the best day of our life or the worst. But we can entrust ourselves to a sovereign God, that he is taking even that which has been intended for evil and use it for good. And that for a greater purpose, far beyond just my individual blessing, but for a corporate purpose that you are executing all over the world, for the gospel to go forth, for lives to be changed, for you to be glorified. So I pray, Lord, that we'd find an encouragement to faith in these words. I pray that we'd see the object of our faith, the one who is the fulfillment of all of your promises and all of your covenants, Jesus Christ. I pray that we'd be encouraged to stick it out when we endure trials of various kinds. I pray, Lord, that you would give help when we feel so weak and so distressed. Thank you, Lord, for your word and this time together. We pray your blessing now on the food as we enjoy fellowship this evening. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you all, and of course, plan to stick around and enjoy a meal with us. If I ever find that passage in Exodus, it was the passage, basically the fulfillment, where Moses, or where they bring the bones of Joseph into the land of, into the promised land. That's all it was. So if I find it, I forgot to write it down here, but they do come through on that promise to bring his bones into the promised land. So just so you know, that loose end gets tied up. All right, thank you all. Stick around for dinner.